Yep.
To be generating greater force than the external.
Yep, that's exactly right. And so you're going to get a concentric contraction. So what happens with isometric?
You're matching the force that is on the outside.
Drop down one leg.
Eccentric or ice?
This is eccentric.
Oh, eccentric is going to be less than.
Yep, I did see eccentric, didn't I?
Isometric.
Isometric, sorry. I'm going off my own list. That's good. Yes, you're correct, and I'm incorrect. You'll find I have no problem saying, hey, you know what? I messed up. Correct me. So, yeah, that's exactly right. The forces between the system and the external forces are equal, and so we have no movement. And that's voluntary, and essentially it becomes voluntary, but it can be what? Minor to maximum. Everybody understand that? So when I hold my water bottle, right, it's an eccentric contraction, but it's voluntary. As far as all of them are voluntary, but I'm holding it and the force is low. But then all of a sudden, if you load this bottle up somehow and it just keeps increasing weight, that literally I'm isometric to some point when I cannot hold that load, and then all of a sudden I start becoming what? Eccentric. So you just need to realize isometric contractions are moving from very, very low forces up to really relatively high forces. So far, so good? And you can strengthen doing isometrics as long as you get enough angles in the range of motion of a joint. So then eccentric, what do we have? The system, and I use that just as a short.
So the muscle joint bone system force is less than the external force.
That's yep.
Length.
Exactly. So let me ask this: is that voluntary or involuntary in terms of once that happens? And what is the level of forces that can go on in eccentric? What do you think?
Maybe both involuntary and voluntary.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, when I say involuntary, that in the end, eccentrically, you will, whether you want to or not, your muscle is going to elongate when those forces just exceed maximum capacity. So far, so good?
So are we within capacity then?
Yeah, so if I'm holding the water bottle and I start lowering it, that is a what? A sub-maximal eccentric contraction. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And if you put a weight, like I talked about the negative lifting, and all of a sudden, once I let that joint, or if you start loading it up and kept loading it, pretty soon, it's going down, okay? And that is now basically a force. That's a maximum eccentric contraction that's being forced because you're just overwhelmed with load. Does that make sense? And so we have those whole ranges. And so you just need to realize that when we talk about that, we were talking about a variation, a range of forces that are going to either cause eccentric, isometric, and or concentric. Got it? Just depends on what we're opposing. And right now we're not dealing with speed because muscle, which we'll look at structure today, but I'll refer to later, is that when you start taking any of those contractions and you start speeding them up in velocity, they start changing the characteristic of what they are. And the classic is, how many would have had the experience? It's easier to lower something than it is to pick it up. It's easier to let it down than to what? Curl it, right? And so in the end, our muscle physiology and structure leads to that consequence, that nature. And so it's both beneficial and maybe problematic. Okay, so very good. Now we ended the day, and we were talking about connective tissue, okay? I'm going to come down here, we're going to be dealing with these other questions. So I had to review, and this is where we ended with. So first off, tell each other what were the connective tissues and what was their function. So this is a review, the last part, and then we're going to be dealing with this question. What were the connective tissues? And what were their where were they located? Not necessarily their function per se. Go ahead and do that.
So epi is located on the top, and it just holds everything together.
It's like around the whole muscle.
Yeah, I think peri is in the middle, right?
Yeah, it's like around the fascicles. No, the epimeses is around the fascicles. It's
Yeah.
around the muscle.
Groups of fibers.
So it's around the fibers.
And then
What fibers are
the
called?
endo is around the fascicles.
Yeah.
And what was the endomysium? Oh,
Fascicles.
so the endomysium is around the individual fibers. Paramysium is around the groups of fibers, and then the epimysium is around the group of fascicles.
Okay, so let's run through them. What were they? I said most inner? Endo, museum. Middle? Peri, museum. And you can say it different ways. Our enunciation I've heard different ways, but museum is how I've heard it. So, and then most outer. Epi. Okay? So with that, we have those three layers. So the endo covers what? Every individual fiber. So every individual fiber, if you have 2 in there, you're an anomaly. I don't know, I'm sure it happens because there's lots of things that can happen, but generally, you'll find I usually rarely say never and always. I'm pretty sort of like, hey, that's pushing off the real extreme. And so you'll always sort of hear me couch that on the majority of it, every fiber is encased with an endomysium, okay? And then what does a perimysium define? Yeah, fasciculars or fasciculized or fasciculus, depending on how you want to announce that too, right? And then epi is the whole sheath, the whole muscle. Okay, so with that in mind, I want you guys just to start, you wrote me down, but just talk again among yourselves. What are benefits and liabilities of those different layers? So we started writing on it. We did get to the writing part of that. It was fairly short, but go ahead, take a minute, just review yourself, talk about it, and then I'll ask you some questions, and we'll see where we can go with it. Okay? And today is really talking about the importance of what structure is, and what are good things and liabilities, and just the idea that what structure matters, and it may not seem very big deal, but in the end, it can be very, very huge or large implications in terms of what we consider normal. Okay, so go ahead, just talk about that. Why multiple layers? What does each benefit maybe happen? What would if we didn't happen? What might happen? All kinds of scenarios.
There's contractile space.
We didn't talk about it on Monday.
There's also greater elastic energy too.
You guys go back, open that up, and that light hits you, you let me know.
Yeah, I don't know. Are you looking?
Right there?
I'm looking at my notes that I took and the arrow
Sometimes with the
when
screen,
he was talking.
you can't see.
Yeah.
So that's,
And then just protection. Because 3 layers are better than 1.
So greater elasticity, protection, and
Contractile space.
contractile space.
Which I think, by having all 3 together, it's like, why have all 3 in a line when you can stack them all up and save the space?
More elastic. Yeah.
Oh, it's like we're saying like 3 rows.
okay, so let's start talking about it, and I'll just ask questions. I'll piggyback on the maybe things you say, or I just say, hey, that's good. And if you guys have questions, maybe about what's said, it's more of almost a fast dialogue, conversation. Okay, as much as we can. So start out. Benefits, liabilities. Why would you put three layers? Why would you work it that way?
For like the motor units, so it's not like all or nothing. If you're recruiting, it's like individual fibers. Kind of.
Okay, well that's really good. So if I have type 1 fire, that motor unit will fire, but not the rest. Mm-hmm. Why is that true? And you don't have to answer that. That's really good though. Anybody? Why would that be true?
We'd be throwing pencils through the roof real quick if the whole muscle fired every time we tried to pick up, so we can have varying levels of force.
That's pretty. Yeah, it's good that you're seeing that. The consequence of that. That's true. So, but why are we normal? You're gonna hear me say this over and over. You accept that you're normal, and it's because of this, right? It's a function that's normal. It happens. But if it didn't, you would be. You would not look right. Right? We all get to say, hey, that looks normal. Oh, that doesn't look very normal. There's a problem. So, in the end, it is true. But what is keeping motor units, 1, just dealing with 1 unit, or 2? So, it's back to connective tissue. So let me ask this: where's the signal that stimulates muscle fibers go? Where's it going? What's it going now?
It's going.
Well, that's very good. That you're ahead of the game on that one, but that it will ultimately do that. But I'm saying, where does it go? Very good. It is. It's the sarcolemma. That's what conducts the electrical impulse. So let me ask this: how many have ever seen a wire? How many have all worked with a power cord, right? Well, why do you have that rubber casing around that power cord? So you don't get zapped, right? Electricity. And by the way, I've had I work around all this kind of stuff, and it's always when all of a sudden, whoa, what? Okay, a new cord. So in the end, what is that endomysium working as? An insulator. And it literally allows, back to what we're saying, is that the whole motor unit of that one and only one is going to respond to that, because I don't have a bleed off of electrical current. Make sense? Remember I was talking about the electrical stimulation for muscle strengthening? How many have ever had that? They'll hook a electrode here and one up here. I used to, when they first came out, a lot of the stuff when I was competing at the time, a lot of this was just coming out, and they gave me one because I damaged my leg, and I was like, how much can I take? And I actually started overdeveloping my vastus medialis. They go, Damon, you're going to have to calm down on that stimulator because it's really creating a problem. And so I said, oh, okay. But in the end, what were they doing? They were pervasing the whole muscle with an electrical current that was basically bypassing the endomysium. Everybody hear that? But as we're built, we have that little sheath, and that allows each motor unit to talk only to what? The fibers that are what? Innervated by that nerve. So very, very important, because it's exactly what you said. I send off a signal, and all of a sudden I may be, just catapulting out of the chair when I really just want to take a drink of water, right? So in the end, really critical. Since we're on the endomysium, what else can you think about what's important about an endomysium? Why would you go to the most inner layer of a fiber? And I'm not going to ask you this whole list, right? This grocery list. You need to know the main components. You need to know where they are, that kind of thing. But this stuff is for us just to think about structure and implication of why it's important. What else? I'll give you a data point. It's all right. You can cough all you want. Cough drops. I'll give you a data point. Or I'll ask you a question that will help you determine what is the muscle most made of, constituted of. Got to be careful when we say made of. But if I was to take a muscle fiber apart, or the muscle is whole, well, that's good. That's a filament, but it's not. That's not the most.
Filaments with water.
Just saying the muscle fiber. Yeah. What did you say?
Isn't it water? It
is water. And if I'm really built up, right, I'm anywhere between 60 and almost maybe more percentage of the muscle fiber is water. So what do you know about water?
Very conductive.
What's that?
Electricity can flow really easily through water.
Okay, that's right, with electrolyte.
It fits in the container that it's put in.
Okay, well, it'll fit in the container, and it will also go out of the container, right? What else do you know about it? Anybody ever seen those water guns? They have the water and they hit the end of the tube, and that thing just shoots out. There's industries that actually cut metal, paper, and everything with water. Mm-hmm. The pressure is so high that they're using water instead of steel. It's very handy because they're not having to keep resharpening stuff. Anybody? Water is not compressible. So literally, you pretty much can apply, gazillion pounds to, I'm sure that it is going to see at some micro level, but in the end, water is not compressible. That's what, when we use, how many have heard the term hydraulics, right? And water has this hydraulic principle. Oil has basically this hydraulic principle, and that's why we can transfer, forces from this end through a tube, right? And they act on the other end. So let me ask this, watch. I'm doing a bicep curl, and I'm from here, and now I'm here. What is happening to that muscle? I got an epimysium and a perimysium, and I got now an endomysium. What's happening to that fiber? Is the volume going? Is the pressures going up or down, or are they always the same?
Pressure's going up.
Yeah. I mean, if I want to feel that muscle, that's really a tight muscle, right? Well, in the end, you literally are what? Closing space. And so what's that mean with the pressure? It's going up, but water doesn't compress. And so my question is take a water balloon, right, with a thin membrane, which is the sarcolemma, and just start doing that. You think it's going to hold up very long? It's not. And so the endomysium, literally on an individual fiber level, is literally containing all the things that we need to make that muscle fiber and then overall that muscle functional. Okay? Outside of the stomach acidically, I can't think of a worse or a more harsh dynamic environment than muscle. Internal, between temperature, changes in gases, change in acidities, all of that. That is probably the most radical environment that you can live in, okay, and or operate in. And so endomysiums are what? Constantly keeping something that's absolutely critical or vital together. And so it becomes very, very useful. So what are other things? Go ahead. We're talking about some benefits. What about liabilities? Anybody? Somebody asked this, is a muscle, and this is an analogy, are they all the same players? I mean, muscle is made up of different players, aren't they? So what makes them a team? And maybe that analogy breaks down. You guys, if I ever give these analogies, Damon, don't give me another analogy. I don't need it, don't want it. Anybody, what makes it a team? I'm tying it to connective tissue. Somebody asked this, how does connective tissue make a whole muscle that has different players in it a team? It has implications in training. It has implications in human performance, and I'll share that here in just a minute. So We said slow twitch fibers, right? One, they're innervated, so they're isolated only to that motor unit. So they kick off and they do an action. So what about 2A and 2X fibers? Neurologically, they don't even wake up. They're not even functioning the way we think about, contraction. But what has to happen to them? So if I'm shortening, when all of a sudden they have to kick in, what is their state? They're also shortened. If I'm stretched, they're also stretched. Unless literally the endomysiums and then the perimysium, they're literally keeping all these fibers that have different natures together in unison. How many are following that concept? Huh? Well, yeah, it works as a connective glue. And we're talking about proteins in terms of what keeps the fiber itself, but all those fibers are what? Together. And so the muscle as an entirety is always positionally ready to do what it has to do. How many follow that? Because if it wasn't, you'd have a problem. Okay? Man, we'll save this for a later question when we start talking about T-tubules. So, in the end, we literally are able to take different units that have different responses to signals, and they're always what? Working in unison. Does that make sense? So let's just talk about, and again, these are just illustrations or examples thinking about, man, here's structure, and this is benefit. And for us, because we've sort of, the way we live with the benefit liability, we always sort of say, oh, hey, it's all good, right? Well, what do we lose when we have connective tissue? What do we lose when we have connective tissue?
Does that have something to do with like stretching and like pulling a muscle maybe?
Well,
like when you like overstretch it, or I don't know.
Okay, no, that's not bad. I mean, yeah, you probably, the less you had, you could, but what is muscle? So there's two components that make muscle force. You have elasticity, which is connective tissue, and then you have the actual contractile elements that actually, the shortening. So far, so good. So let me ask this. Is a muscle absolutely as powerful as it can be? And the answer is absolutely not, because it has X percentage of connective tissue. So connective tissue is taking away contractile units, but in the end, we need connective tissue to function those contractile units. And so my point is, if you said, hey, we need the most powerful muscle, how can we get around connective tissue? You would have a more problem because you're not taking up space with tissue that doesn't contract. So there's a liability. And you're literally saying, it's like basically saying, I have a car and I need a certain weight, frame, because I know I'm going to need it because I'm going to take a pounding. But then I'm driving easy in the city. Well, then I can have a lighter frame. But in the end, connective tissue is absolutely essential to what? Keep the fiber intact, keep all the fibers together. And so we lose the contractile force because it's what? All layered with connective tissue. And all of us, when you eat dinner, or if you're a meat eater, every once in a while you get into more of that connective tissue and you realize that's what? Really tough stuff, but it has nothing to do with contraction. So far, so good? Go ahead.
So is there like a balancing act between the connective tissue and the amount of force you can get around?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that we call what our life is as normal as that balancing act. Okay. If you wanted to somehow genetically engineer and push something one way, you probably find the muscle more vulnerable. If you genetically engineer it, you find it less vulnerable, but maybe less forceful, right? And so, again, we're just sort of talking about being bioengineers with the implication of connective tissue. Are we all holding up all right with that's what I want us to do, is work through mentally. There is a danger in me just saying, oh, connective tissue, endo, peri, epi. Okay, on to the next point, and what I'm saying is that these things all have implications, and you guys have the ability to think about them, figure them out. You don't have to read about them. You just got to look and say, well, if it does this, then what is it not doing? And I think that's really important. That's what we're doing. That's what we're spending a lot of today about in doing that. So I lose contractile space. What else might I? Any other liabilities? What else? Yeah.
Could it act as a limiter, possibly? Yes, you lose contractile space, but I'm thinking of how to give the example of say Supermom, her baby gets stuck under a car, she lifts the car up.
Right.
All that connective tissue has torn apart because the muscle had to generate such a high power, it just basically broke all its chains to undo all its full potential.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't know if I think about it as a limiter other than in the end you would have not even got to that point without that connective tissue. Okay. So ultimately you're destroying the structure because you're overloading it.
Okay.
So, anybody? Other liabilities can you think of? You don't want to say it. You can't think of it. Okay, well, that's all right. I just want to, I want to keep us moving on and talking about this because I have more questions for you. Aren't you happy? Okay, so we talked about motor units, and we talked about how they individually are working with each of the fibers, okay? And we have connective tissue, which we talked about, that protects that. Then we talked about, I want to talk about muscle structure. And if I was to ask you, if you're looking at your notes, try not to look at it, but if we were working down from the muscle, what would be the next smaller unit? So you go muscle, another unit, and then another unit, and then another unit, and another unit. What are the, so tell each other, if I was working down, the muscle is the most macro unit, the biggest unit, what's the next divisions of those units down? And they're all able to contract, except the last one. So can anybody remember the structure? So literally you're moving from the outside collectively down to a smaller unit, to a smaller unit, and I'll just draw a circle. So here's the muscle. And then you have these units. And then within these units, you have a subunit. And within that unit, you have a subunit of that. So muscle, perimysium, myofibrils is what I'm getting at. Fibers, I should say. So fibers, myofibrils, and then what's the last?
Myofilaments.
What's that? Myofilaments. Yep, and that's where we said actin and so forth, right? So we have all these, we have these multiple layers, literally. So the muscle is, to me, the macro is the biggest contractile unit. Then these perimysiums are literally almost like subdivisions. The fibers are almost like an entire muscle, but at what? One strand. So far, so good. And then we get down to myofibrils, which is like a micro muscle. And then we actually get down to the filaments. So the question is, which one of those does not shorten? Which one of those groups? And I don't have the complete list here, but I went fibers, myofibrils, and so forth. And by the way, a muscle fiber is also known as a muscle cell. One fiber equals one cell. They're one and the same. So which one of those doesn't shorten? Can you remember? Again, this is a review. It's just making sure that we get ourselves collectively together.
Filaments.
Very good. Filaments slide, but they don't shorten. All the other units here, and then they got perimysium, and then the entire muscle, all of these shorten. Got it? Filaments don't. And that's where you hear the sliding filament theory, which we'll talk about. It'll be more, again, it's a review. It's not something that I spend much time on, but it does have implications in how muscle is acting. Okay? And so we have these micro layers, these repetitive layers. What do we gain from that? This one you don't have to write. What do we gain from that? In fact, I'll show you guys. I'll click this up real quick. If you take this picture, move your mouse around, you'll get different pictures. So here's an individual fiber, and then here is the actual myosin and actin filaments, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So what do you gain from that microstructure? Right there, you're looking at it. So you have connective tissue within connective tissue within connective tissue. And by the way, I will share with you one other implication about connective tissue where it has potentially disadvantages. But right here, what do we gain from that? Anybody here had a severe muscle pull? If you ever see anyone that has a really severe muscle pull, they literally can have a permanent dent in their muscle. You literally run your finger down and dip, but they're functional. Why? Because we have multiple. We're not just one contractile unit. We have a whole redundancy. So we literally can take damage. How many have had damage in muscles and you're still able to what? Move. It may not be looking quite the same. And even if you're really motivated, you can look the same until you get done and rest, right? But in the end, the muscle, literally these multiple contractile units make it very, very possible to what? Take damage and just keep going. Humans are really robust. It is hard. You know, everyone says, wow, I took a hit, or wow, this person. But overall, physiologically, humans are built to survive. Okay? And muscle is absolutely critical to survival, and it is built by multiple layers, redundancy again. It makes it what we call robust. It is hard to stop. Okay? And so we have this multiple layers of this. So let me talk about the connective tissue. Let me ask this. If you have three people all tied together, so listen carefully. So connective tissue is that thing that's tying them together. So far, so good? And we're all having to try to run or pull something, you know, a wagon or whatever. And you have one person that's really fast, another person that's sort of fast, and then one that's really slow. What is the problem with connective tissue? Because like I told you, a benefit is that they're always together positionally, right? Well, what starts happening when I have to start running faster? The slow person slows me down. Everybody hear that? Because that tissue may not be active and or it can't physically keep up. So take slow twitch. So for example, world-class sprinters, they're probably world-class sprinters not just because they have a percentage of fast twitch, it's because they have a lack of slow twitch. How many follow what I just stated? Because if it's not contributing, what do we call it? It's drag. Does that make sense? And a lot of times we don't think about that equation. And so somehow you can convert fibers, right? You can move them, shift them over. You could see a performance difference, but we usually know genetically you're determined by a certain percentage. There are people, and I tend to hold to this, that at certain ages, like in very young ages, in puberty, pre-puberty, adolescence, that potentially you could alter slightly your fiber typing by what the kind of activity that you might do. And I've heard, and I tend to hold, I look at certain people, you look at certain case studies, you go, fascinating. And there's cases for the neurological development and the type of stimulus and how sensitive they are to those loads. So, but generally we're predetermined genetically of X amount fibers, and over age, as we get older, we lose certain fiber types because of stimulus, not necessarily because of per se genetics. And so, in the end, tying together, this is back to a liability. It's both a benefit and what? A liability, depending on what I'm having to do. So let's talk about the filaments. What you have? What are filaments? I said them quickly. So you guys go ahead and, if you can't, just outline the filaments and sort of what they're made up of, maybe where they're connected. Just do that, and then we'll work through that. Because I want to get to, we're working through it. We'll get to some analysis questions. So go ahead and do that.
And it's made of actin-myosin, trypomyosin, and troponin.
Nice. What was the third one?
Troponin? Oh,
That was-
trypomyosin?
Trypomyosin, that's right.
Yeah.
Troponin, trypomyosin, myosin, and actin. Isn't there like 4 other ones too, like
There's
titin?
titin, collagen, and elastin, and something else.
Wow, how do you remember those?
I just remember it. I
That's
don't
pretty
know.
good.
This one's random things.
So myosin, actin, troponin, trypomyosin, titin,
I remember it because I got it wrong.
elastin. I got the titin one wrong on the exam too.
On AMP?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or not for for X-ray.
I still remember it.
No, I
still
remember
remember
from
the question
X-ray.
from stupid.
Okay, so you guys, what are the filaments? 2 major filaments.
Actin-myosin.
Actin and myosin. What is on the myosin? And what is the actin? What carries, what are related to those? What would you attach to them structurally?
Troponin.
Okay, so troponin's on what? Tropomyosin and troponin are on actin. Yeah. And what's on the myosin? Yeah, very good. The myosin's, if we said troponin and tropomyosin in the myosin heads and or the cross-bridging heads are on the myosin. Which one's the bigger fiber or filament? Myosin. Yep. And our pictures never do us justice, right? But there is an incredible 3-dimensional structure within muscle, and so you have attachments that are happening among the whole thing. And what do those filaments attach to? The filaments, every filament, actin, myosin. Now, by the way, I have good news for you. You don't need to worry about any of the bands. I remember A band, H band, all that. We don't need to worry about that. The questions I'm going to ask, that's what you need to be able to respond to, okay, and or think through. So, anybody, what's connected?
Z-disc.
Yeah, very good. Z-lines. Yeah, that's very good. And so you have Z-lines, the Z-disc, and we'll just call them Z-lines. And so what is attached to the Z-lines? Actin. Everybody got that? And then we have a protein bridge that holds the myosin in place, and they literally have this interaction. So far, so good? And so, like I said, Friday we'll talk about the sliding filament theory. So what's that unit called? What's the unit called? It's got an actin and a myosin, and in between. Very good. It's sarcomere. Yeah, sarcomere. That is, listen carefully, the smallest fundamental functioning contractile unit is a sarcomere. Single sarcomere is like the micro of micro muscle. Everybody got that? Because it literally shortens. Z-line to Z-line. So you have these filaments sliding, but the sarcomere itself can be longer and or what? Get shorter. Clear? Okay. So far, so good? So I'm going to put up a picture. So if you click in here, you'll see that. So if you go back here, go back one more. So here are these filaments. You see thick and thin, large and small. And then you come over here, and here's the picture of them. You can see the bridges, so we're not going to worry about this area right now. I'm still talking about and interested in this Z-line sarcomere definition. So, what is the limit of a muscle shortening? What is the condition? What keeps the muscles from being able to shorten more? And I know that my arm hits my arm, but if we took a muscle and just hung it on a rod, right, and we stimulated it, it would only shorten a certain distance. Anybody? So talk about it for a minute. Just take a minute, talk about it. And then the other question is, what is its limit in lengthening? What is the limit of the sarcomere or the muscle lengthening? Okay, so go ahead.
What keeps it from lengthening is, what keeps it from shortening is like the amount of overlap already occurs.
So it like reaches the other Z line and
has to stop.
Yeah, I don't really know.
So everybody, what's your thought? What's it looked like you were on the right track. Anybody? So this is the Z lines. This is the myosin. It is what?
They can only contract as far as until the actins on opposing ends.
Yeah, they run out of space to contract. Literally, the limit is the myosin, right? And so your muscle gets as short as. But what I'm going to bring up is that whatever's happening at the macro level of the muscle is at the micro level the same thing's going on. And that's what I'm trying to make you have a connection. I find students sometimes say, "Oh, the muscle's shortening," and I say, "Well, what's happening to sarcomere?" I have no idea. And that's what I'm trying to do: is say, "Look, you need to be able to think from the outer to the underlying micro structure that's going on." So, when a muscle's most contracted, what can you say about the sarcomere? It is the shortest. How many follow that? So, what's the lengthening limit? What's the lengthening limit? So, look at that. Someone come up with a complete statement. What's the lengthening limit? What's that?
As long as the myosin is.
That's right, until the last tips or whatever the percentage is that we have some threshold, right? I don't know if you can get down to the last cross bridge, but in the end now, so this is the actins, and they're bumped up against each other essentially. And now here are the actins, and they're barely hanging on. Can you follow my picture? Right? And so now that is the limit, and you can't necessarily go further because you